released, and it gives us some picture of the vulnerability of the world supply chain in shipping and distribution when we see, and you can see it in this little picture on the bottom right, 400 vessels delayed because the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal. And you see how this is impacted. There's a vessel just loaded in Vietnam that will load 18,000 containers. And it's a real, not in Vietnam, but the whole vessel. And we just get some idea of the fragility of these long, difficult supply chains. So we're looking at now, still looking at high freight rates. We're looking at difficulties with containers. They haven't been discharged in ports in Europe and the United States quick enough. There are vessels returning empty to China to reload. And of course, the Suez Canal problem, now resolved, will take some days, maybe some weeks to get back to normal. But normal in shipping and supply chains around the world, post-coronavirus and at the last, hopefully the end of the coronavirus, it's still quite disrupted. Rates are high. Container availability is not ideal, and this needs to be carefully watched. It's affecting some products more than others. It's affecting some regions more than others. It's a big issue in China and generally in Asia. It's less of an issue in West Africa. So let's have a look then at the trade situation, and let's start with Vietnam, the best place to start at this time of year. So what we've seen, and you can see on this chart, the cumulative imports, 2019, 2020, 21. You can see the 3 months. So if we look at this, you see a big jump in imports into Vietnam over the first 2.5 months of this year. And it's remarkable in one sense, that volume imported in such a period of time, well over the 2020 figure, but I think we're better in any case to measure against 2019, which was a much less disrupted year. Looking at that, it's still quite a remarkable figure, up by about 200,000 tons. Let's try and put a bit of context on that. And it's important in this to look at balances, to look at what's gone in and as well as what's gone out, to try and get an idea of where the supply actually lies. And you remember, if you were with us 2 sessions ago, we talked about the dynamics in the market at this time of year, and particularly about the role of Vietnam in setting the tone, setting the sentiment, determining the market psychology. And because Vietnam is the biggest processor and a huge buyer of RCN, changes in production, changes in the situation, changes in the balance of supply and demand of RCN in Vietnam can have a much bigger impact on the market than simply the numbers, than simply the tonnage that's involved in those changes. If we look at exports, very, very strong export performance. We're looking at 26% increase in exports, approximately calculates out to about 75,000 tons of RCN. So when we look at this, if exports are up, which they are, by about 75,000 tons RCN basis, and imports are up by about 200,000 tons, we need to look at the balance. So when we net that out, what we're looking at is an increase in supply of about 130,000 tons. Sounds like a lot, but because Vietnam is such a huge processor, that's only about 25 days of processing stock based on the current trend in exports. So it is a big increase, but in reality, it's not a huge extension in terms of the availability of RCN. And that's important to remember when we look at the sentiment in the market and the reaction of the market. So let's have a look at the trade situation in Vietnam in terms of where these imports came from. And here we have 2019, 2020, 2021 imports to the end of February. I don't have figures for the middle of March by origin. I just have the total figures. So when we look at this, we'll see that the main source of additional imports is Tanzania, the red bar. 2019, there was virtually nothing from Tanzania in Jan-Feb. Last year, quite a healthy import, and this year this has gone up. It's just over 100,000 tons. There's also been an increase on last year from Cambodia, but if we compare that to 2019, which is a more valid comparison, given that there was disruptions on the Vietnam-Cambodia border at this time last year due to the coronavirus, we can see that imports to Vietnam from Cambodia are actually down on the figure for 2019, which is interesting given, number one, the Cambodian crop is bigger, in fact, much bigger than it was in 2019, and still a lower volume had come across into Vietnam for processing by the end of February. Is that a signal on the Cambodian crop? Well, we can't be entirely sure. Indications are that the Cambodian crop is late, but there's no question, no suggestion really at this time that there's any problem with the Cambodian crop per se, other than that lateness. So if we look at this situation and we think about how has that come about, we start to look back and we talk about the timing of trade, and we start to look at if we take the situation, for example, on imports of RCN to Vietnam during November and December of last year. You might remember at that time the market was beginning to tighten a little bit on RCN. People were getting concerned about whether or not there would be enough material available. There were some stocks in warehouses in transit that were custom cleared at that time. And really what's happened here is that the imports are stronger in the first quarter because they were a little bit lower in November and December compared to the previous year. So we have a balancing situation here. It wouldn't be right, given lower imports last year, given a delayed crop, as we expect in Cambodia and Vietnam, it wouldn't be right to conclude that the 200,000 ton increase solves completely the supply chain issue, even in the short term. If we have a look at the situation in terms of the balance sheet, this is by no means an exact science, but it's something I like to do to give us an indication of where we are. So these are the numbers expressed in raw cashew nut tons. Everything here is raw cashew nut tons, and this is a balance sheet calculation on the 15th of March. So if we put everything into account, if we take into account the imports as they are, the exports up by 26%, as I've mentioned, and if we factor into that, let's say for the sake of this discussion, a 4-week delay in the Vietnamese crop. I'm not saying at all that the crop is smaller than the estimate that's come out from Vietnam, which is 350,000 tons. What I am saying is that I'm factoring in, for the sake of a scenario, factoring in what would it look like if this was 4 weeks late. And here we are. If we look at 1st of March, or 15th of March, actually, this should be, the stock is significantly down on what it would have expected to be in a normal crop. So that means, as we look at it today, the position on RCN in Vietnam still remains relatively tight, assuming a crop of around this 350,000 tons figure, a figure mentioned by Vinicas in recent days. That suggests to me that imports to Vietnam in the coming year will at least hit the record figure of 2019, which was 1.6 million tons, and it possibly could rise as high as 1.8 million tons. And that would be dependent on exports continuing as they have been strong, and we'll talk about that again in a moment. And it would also depend on the timing of purchases in East Africa toward the end of the year. But we're certainly looking at a pretty good demand based on this. So if the crop were to be lower, we can increase the figure of imports by the same amount as the year goes on. That's based on the idea that imports will continue as they have gone. It's based on the idea that the crop is pretty good, and it's based on the idea that there will be availability, mainly in West Africa, of this 1.6 million tons. That's Vietnam. In summary, tight position. We need to look at the balances, not just the numbers. The temptation is always to say, well, 360,000 tons of imports, no problem. But we need to look at also what's gone out, what's afloat, and what's to come in later. Let's look at the giant of the cashew processing industry, the Indian situation. This is very early days in India in terms of the crop. If we look at trade, first of all, we see imports in January are down on last year, certainly, a bit better than 2019, but average start to the season, let's say. I've noticed in the last few weeks as the crop has been coming in that there have been fewer stories of problems, that there have been fewer issues on the weather. We can't be sure, but it does appear that prospects for the Indian crop have improved. And if we look at these balances again, we look at quite a strong import performance toward the end of last year. India, I think it was 873,000 tons RCN was imported to India last year. It's not altogether surprising that January would be down a little bit. I don't think that we should read too much into that. Prices in India at the farm gate are around about where they were just before the lockdown last year. The strict lockdown in India was around it was on the 23rd of March. After that, prices became a bit volatile and prices fell. But prior to that, they were roughly where they are today, and prices have started again this year around that price. We are unfortunately seeing a rising incidence of COVID-19 in India. You can see on this little diagram drawn from the Johns Hopkins University, you can see that there is an increase in cases and in the 7-day incidence, and that's obviously being watched closely. There may well be further lockdowns in India, which could potentially affect the gathering of the crop and particularly the movement of the crop to processors. If we look at the Indian balance sheet, let's have a quick look at that. And comparing 2021 in orange to 2020 in blue, we're looking at a very similar situation actually in terms of the closing balance as at the 15th of March. Demand in India has improved a little bit, I understand. The crop is coming. There were a few concerns, but it seems to be alleviated now. Export of kernels from India looks a little bit better. I would expect India to take back some of its market share that it lost last year. In 2019, India exported about 60,000 tons of kernels. That was reduced to 50,000 last year, mainly due to the coronavirus disruption, and most of that demand was picked up by Vietnam. But I would expect an improvement in domestic usage, although it wasn't bad last year. It was nowhere as bad as might have been expected this time last year. An improvement in exports, and probably in this coming year, I think on what I'm seeing now, and assuming the crop comes in well, India will import a little bit less. It might be around about 790,000 tons, which is almost 100,000 tons less. We won't know that till later in the year, but that's where it's looking now. And that's based on an improvement in the crop. Last year's crop, which had been looking quite good, was disrupted by the pandemic. And I'm assuming that will be addressed this year. And we're looking at a crop, we're thinking around 750,000 tons, mainly based on trade estimates and reports from friends in India. So the Indian situation looks quite balanced. I think Indian buyers do have a lot of RCN to buy, of course, but as their crop comes in, it should be relatively normal process for them. That could change if there's a disruption in the movement of RCN around the country. Don't forget that processing in India these days is quite diversified in its location. So RCN has to move around the country or has to be imported. Let's look elsewhere at demand. We have a look, first of all, at US imports. So the US figures for January are out, and we can see that the imports in January 2021 were lower than 2020, but higher than 2019. Generally, the US imports at the end of last year were pretty positive and possibly better than actually expected. US imports were up by about 7.9% last year. Very, very positive, given that that market had been growing at relatively low levels. It's been growing, I think the CAGR is below 2% in India. So 4 times that to get up at almost 8% is quite impressive in a year of a pandemic disruption. So it looks relatively positive. Again, I wouldn't be reading too much into the January figure. I'd like to see what happens through March and April before I judge where the US market might be going. If we look a little bit further afield, so at this time of year, we don't have a lot of actual import figures, but we do have shipment figures from Vietnam, and we have shipment figures from India. So I took a look at January and February shipments from Vietnam to some of the key markets. So first of all, we looked comparison 2019, 2020, and 21. So first thing we see is that US trade and imports around about the same level as last year in terms of shipments from Vietnam. So much of these products will not yet have arrived in the United States. They would have been shipped in January and in February. And you can just see how far ahead of 2019 these last 2 first parts of the year have been. If we look in China, we see quite a remarkable spike in demand. I cannot say whether this is indicative of a longer term trend. I can say that we know that there are a lot of reports of positive consumption of nuts in China, not necessarily cashew nuts, but nuts in general. And the shipments from Vietnam well up on 2019. Now, of course, they're way over 2020, but that's because the shipments were stopped during the early part of the crisis in February 2020. Looking in the European market, and we see a continued steady rise. So we see European imports year on year growing, and we might talk about some of those trends a little bit later with them. But generally speaking, pretty positive in Europe. This is based on the top 6 in Europe, so Germany, the Netherlands, the UK, France, Spain, and Italy as markets. Most of that trade, of course, is transit through the Netherlands on into a whole range of countries, and there's a growing direct import into the UK and into Germany. Why are Vietnamese kernels shipments figures so important? Well, simply because last year, Vietnam supplied 74% of Europe's imports of cashew kernels and a remarkable 91% of the United States imports of cashew kernels. So we get a good idea of where trade is and where trade is going by simply looking at the Vietnamese shipment figures. If we look at the Indian figures, we see a similar pattern, but we only have figures for January at this stage. So we see typical US pattern and the same pattern for most European countries. What could be factors in this increase? People are talking about rising freight prices encouraging early shipments. People are talking about buyers bringing in to have a strategic stock of kernels. I'm not so sure about that. Stocks in Vietnam were limited in January, February. Whether you can accelerate in those conditions, I don't know. Whether you can accelerate relatively low-priced contracts ahead of the harvest? I doubt. So I do think that there's a little bit more to this than just a cautious approach on freight. And actually, when we look at this, and if we just look back at this US imports monthly, you're looking at a pretty healthy position in 2020. I mean, there was this stutter in the middle of the year, but throughout the last 4 months of 2020, month on month, improvements on the previous year. And that's continued now. So there is something going on here on demand, and there's no real sign of demand slowing down. Let's continue with demand, and let's step back a little bit and have a look at some of our figures from 2020. And if we look just in general terms, we look at 4 big regions. So China, European Union, the US and India, and we look at consumption. So the figures for 3 of them, China, Europe and the US, are based on actual imports and trade, imports less exports. And India is based on a much more calculated, the whole balance sheet to work out what was actually consumed. When we look at it, what we're seeing over the period is very little impact of COVID-19, except for India. So India had an impact, and that was essentially the loss of about 3 months trade in the second quarter, or late in the first quarter, early in the second quarter. But in Europe and in China, we see very strong trends emerging. In America, there has been a positive trend, but I'm less convinced that this is a longer term trend as I believe it to be in China and Europe. I think that the US demand increase last year may have been much more related to pandemic lockdowns and restrictions than anything else. And whereas I have a feeling that in Europe and in China, that it's a much more underlying growth and change in demand patterns. If we take those figures and we try and project them, and I've tried to be conservative here. So for example, I've said that European Union demand, which grew last year by around about 15%, at least imports grew by 15%. I've cut that back to 5% for this year. I've cut US growth back to about 2%. In other words, returning back to the trend that was there previously, what we'd come to consider a normal trend. I still think it leaves us with consumption rising in 2021, mainly based on the recovery of demand in India, assuming that the year goes out as it has so far, relatively positively, managing pandemic problems rather than locking down the whole country, and relatively modest growth in all of the other countries, including China and the European Union. So in a sense, I could justify this figure heading up toward 900,000 without too much problem, but I think we should be conservative, and I think we should take a relatively low-key approach to the growth in demand this year, not because I think there's a problem, not at all, on the contrary, but because I think there is a pandemic, there's the economic consequences of a pandemic, and we just don't know. So if we take that on and we start to talk about what could these developments mean, and we need to think about the crop delay. If you think back to the session on the dynamics, it's about a month ago now, it doesn't seem it, but it is, when we talked about the calendar and how much availability of RCN shifts later in the year as a result of a later crop. So at this time of year, about 55% of the crop comes in March, April, May, June. The red is the availability. And if you get a delay in Vietnam, that shifts right. So instead of more product available in March and April, it heads out into May and June. And of course, that is an impact. It's an impact in West Africa because it should mean earlier buying, more activity than we've seen in recent years. And that's been the case. But it still means that the kernels that are generated from that imported RCN will probably not be available until May. So if it's shipped I always use a figure of about 80 days. So if it's shipped today or in the last week from Abidjan, for example, add on 80 days plus then for your processing, and you start to get out into May for the availability of that product. So one of the consequences of our long, tortuous supply chain in the cashew business is that it's very difficult to adjust a shortage or a later than expected crop in one area by compensating with production elsewhere, simply because you got to move the RCN. There's not enough processing in West Africa yet, and there's not enough production in Asia yet to adjust quickly. So that would mean, at least on what we know now, that a tight position on the availability of kernels should emerge during April and May. And it raises the question, will that tightness, will that, maybe even scarcity might be the right word to use towards the second half of April, will that act as a catalyst for higher kernels prices? And that's largely about the way buyers might see it. If they see it emerging as a problem in terms of getting their shipments, as a problem that might have longer term consequences for contracts, it could be a catalyst to go and buy or rebuy those container loads of kernels. If they see it as a short term phenomenon that will change, they may well take a much more conservative approach and do as they have been doing, picking off a few containers here and there, looking at some good value, buying that, and then taking another week to reassess the situation. Consequences for Africa. What does this mean for Africa? I think we've seen more competition for early RCN than we have done in recent years. We see steadier farm gate prices. We've certainly seen that over the last week. If you want to read the ACA cashew splits this week, you'll see our analysts reporting steady farm gate prices right across the region from Nigeria all the way through Cote d'Ivoire to Burkina Faso on those crops that are coming in. What we may also see, and which is quite positive, is more demand for African kernels. And this would be maybe more demand in the short term to replace delayed shipments from Vietnam. And that could, if for processors, that could be an opportunity not only to make a sale, but also to make a little bit of a breakthrough with customers in export markets. So there's something there to be built on, let's say. We have seen some deals. We've seen some major deals done for Vietnam on RCN. The Indian market's been relatively quiet, quieter than you might expect. And we have to be careful on kernels prices because they're not only are they steady, we've seen prices move up by 15 to 20 cents a pound. It is still possible to buy some what I would consider low-priced or cheapy, almost 320s in Vietnam. Anything below $3 to my mind is remarkable. Some of those are still around, but major shippers, certified shippers, forward shipments are much higher. They've moved up 15, 20 cents a pound. And that's without anyone really chasing it. That's on a relatively modest trade. All of the volume that we've seen done at the moment is really filling gaps, waiting to see the next stage. So it wouldn't be surprising to see some more demand for African cashew kernels, particularly from factories that have the right certification and the right quality factors. And that, of course, is supported by freight disruption, either slow shipments or more expensive shipments. You can buy containers in West Africa and have them in Europe within 15 to 20 days. So let's look and see what are the consequences. And let's look at this now from a different point of view. We've just been considering the consequences of a late crop in Vietnam. So let's think about what would happen if there were a lower or smaller crop in Vietnam. Well, a lot of the same things would happen. The kernels market would continue for the next couple of months. You would expect to get tight. There may be some buying. The chances for buyers to consider the tightness in supply as a catalyst to pay higher prices would be increased. if they think that the crop is actually fundamentally lower in Vietnam. There's a lot of discussion on this Vietnamese crop right now. Some people are saying that it's just late. Some people are saying that its older trees have been impacted, and that's what's causing the crop to be delayed, but that younger trees are not impacted. We have seen farm gate prices slip back a little bit in the last 10 days or so. It could be that it's just late. So I'm not saying it's lower. What I'm saying is, what if the crop were lower? Now, does it mean an awful lot? What does it really mean if the Vietnamese crop is lower? So I just combined Vietnam and Cambodia here. So it's very hard to separate them when you try to analyze this market. And we looked at the 3-year history and the latest estimate by region. And if we look at it, in actual fact, you're only talking about, I think, about 16% of world production in the region. So a drop in that is by no means hugely significant for the overall supply and demand situation, particularly if, as expected, India has a pretty good or an average to good crop, and West Africa has the crop which I think everyone is expecting, which is a pretty decent crop, maybe not as great as some of the early official estimates painted it, but still a pretty good crop. So I think that if we look at the Vietnamese crop at around this 350,000 ton level, which is now spoken about, down from the 450,000 tons of last year, it doesn't actually cause a major problem. It doesn't cause a major shortage taken over the course of the entire year. The difference is made up in other major producing countries, Cote d'Ivoire, India, and across the region in West Africa. What it does is it just causes this tightness of supply early in the season. Basically a consequence of having a long, difficult supply chain all the way from farm gate in West Africa through to factories in Vietnam. It would only really have an impact, and this is often the case in cashews, when we look at it down the years, that it really needs 2 major origins to have a problem. So if you see a problem emerging in India, or less likely, but also possible in Cote d'Ivoire, then you're talking about getting into an issue of a fundamental shortage of supply. But it doesn't need a fundamental shortage of supply to cause the market sentiment to change. And we may see a change in market thinking so that instead of people saying, $3 320s, $3.10 320s are great value, and I'm going to buy those as time goes on, but I'm going to take my time, they start to say $3, $3.10, $3.15, that's great, and I'm going to buy it today. And that can change the market sentiment. And that would have a knock-on effect right back to the farm gate in West Africa. The other factor, which I've mentioned, and I'm going to mention again, is there are a lot of low-price contracts. There are a lot of contracts below $2.85. There are contracts even lower than that. And if they're defaulted, and looking at it today, some of them will be. Now, they won't be people walking away from the contract. It will be delay it, defer it. Can you wait till next year? Can you wait 3 months? Can you wait till the crop is over for your shipment? And then we'll see how that pans out over time. But if that happens, the defaults are often the factor that causes the chain reaction. So people have product bought at low prices. They see the market moving away. Their supplier is not giving them the supply. They rebuy the contracts, and on it goes again. And we saw that we see it every time this market goes into one of those big booms. 2017, end of 2016 being the last time that happened. Needs to be watched. There's no question that a lot of the ingredients are there for an increase in cashew prices. I don't believe that the ingredients for a big run-up in prices or a big rally in prices are really there. I don't see a 2016 scenario. I don't see a 2011 scenario by any means. I do think we could see stronger kernels prices as the year goes on. I'd like to think that we will see prices hit some sort of equilibrium level, if we can use that term in relation to cashews, where, which is probably somewhere around $3.40 to $3.50, 320s, that the market would get to a level which works for everyone, and that it would stay there for a while, allowing demand to grow, allowing the business to continue. I'm not ruling out a speculative bubble, but I don't think the ingredients are there for that, but I do think they are there for firming kernels prices over the next 3 to 6 months. All right, let's have a look at production. And this is our idea on production. I've referred to it. You'll see there's quite a gap between the current year high estimate and the current year low estimate. So what I do is I take a kind of a survey of official bodies, trade associations, traders, processors, as many people as I can talk to, and I ask them to tell me about their estimates of the crop. Or sometimes we have a conversation and they don't even realize they're telling me, but we have that conversation. And I take the lows and I take the highs and I see where it leaves us. And you can see there's quite a gap here between the low and the high this year. I think we can probably conclude overall that the crop this year is better than last year. It's probably down in Vietnam, but it's probably up in India. It's probably up in West Africa. And it was, as we know, already down significantly in Tanzania. All added up, my guess is that some of the more ambitious crop estimates that we've seen from official sources in West Africa are overstated. That, Benin is not going to harvest 160,000 tons of RCN, in my opinion, but it will have a good crop. I don't think there was an original estimate from Cote d'Ivoire of 900,000 tons. I think that's now reduced to 848,000 tons, which may be much more realistic. That's where the gap comes between the two. If we look at rather than focusing on the absolute numbers and how accurate or not they are, we should look at the key discussion points as we come to the end of March. First of all, the Vietnamese crop. And the big question is it late or is it low? Is it a 3-4 weeks late and it will come in, or is it a much lower crop than would be expected? Well, I've spoken about the optimistic official estimates, and they're coming now back down to something that looks a little bit more matching what people in the field, people in the trade are saying. So when I come down to our estimate of the crop, I'm coming out at 3.64 million tons. There are some other estimates around 3.8 million tons. I think we're not too far wrong, around 3.64 million tons. If we look at consumption, and I mentioned earlier the factors that are taken into account, a growth but slower growth in Europe, continued average growth in China, slower growth in the US heading back towards the 5-year average. If we put that together and we take the recovery in India based on better economic circumstance and perhaps better management of the pandemic, you can make a case that consumption comes out at about 3.8 million tons on an RCN basis. Of course, outturn figures and so on will change that slightly. Looking at that, I don't think we should be concluding there's necessarily a shortage or a fundamental shortage emerging. I think what we can say is that supply and demand are very well matched, perhaps more tightly matched this year than last year or the year before. I think we can probably say that that's a trend that is continuing. If you were with us 2 sessions ago, we talked about how production growth in West Africa is slowing down. And we talked about how consumption growth in certain markets has actually been accelerating over the past 2 or 3 years. So we would expect that this would happen. What it means is that there's more opportunity for increased production, better post-harvest handling, better organization of the supply chain. Cashew surplus or deficit doesn't tend to come out as big dramatic news. What happens is, because there's a harvest, almost every month of the year, with the exception of August, someone somewhere is harvesting a cashew nut. And because supply comes to the market so spread out over the year, you don't tend to get dramatic movements. They tend to kick in when you get a combination of factors. Tight supply demand, plus short positions, plus a little bit of speculation, usually on RCN, maybe a currency movement, maybe somebody gets caught, maybe there's defaults of contract. All these factors come together, and that's when you get these explosions in price that we see from time to time. I don't think this year is one of those years. Well, let's have a look at Africa. And we can see, generally in Africa, I want to draw your attention to two facts. Firstly, that the estimates of the crop, generally speaking, are a little bit lower now than they were earlier, but that's not necessarily due to poor harvests. It's, I think, due to overestimation of the crop. That's a fact, I think. Just park that now. If we look at the general crop situation, it looks pretty positive right across West Africa. I here look at Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Ghana, Benin, which covers the bulk of production. And we see generally positive developments in the crop. But what we are seeing in a longer term is a slowing of growth. I mean, compare 2008 to 2015 with a more recent trend, 2016 up to 20. We're not seeing the same speed of growth that we've seen previously. That'll be natural. You couldn't keep up that pace. And that will have a long-term effect if consumption continues to grow. In 2021, about 55% of the world's cashews will be grown in African countries. 46% in West Africa. Slightly down on last year, but that's simply because India's recovered, or India's expected to recover. Farm gate prices are steady. They are particularly strong in areas of higher quality. So in Benin, recognized for high quality, prices are quite strong. In parts of eastern Cote d'Ivoire, where quality is higher, but also there's the temptation of cross-border trade into Ghana, prices are higher too. So you are getting a range of prices. And there's a lot of things influence price, of course. I mean, quality is one I've mentioned, location, distance from the port, competition between buyers, the availability of cash in the area, whether there's a processor in the area. All of these factors influence farm gate prices. So to say farm gate prices are steady is, it's a pretty broad, sweeping statement. There are variations, and no doubt you'll find places where prices are weak. But I think overall we can say, if I look, Nigeria, Benin, Ghana is pretty steady. Cote d'Ivoire, we've seen prices rise over the past week. We're seeing more activity. We're seeing more buying. We're seeing more money available. And that's all having an impact. Production, West Africa, I guess is going to be up this year. Probably up enough to make up any loss between West Africa and India, to make up any loss that we can envisage at this moment in Vietnam. But Africa's position as a producer continues to grow. If we look at the share of production, Vietnam and Cambodia together at 16%. And remember, Cambodia is growing rapidly. India still at 21%, not growing at all quickly, an average growth rate of less than 2% over the last 10 years. East Africa, down a little bit this year, a less than expected crop in Tanzania. I would imagine that will be corrected in years to come. Tanzania will increase its production, and West Africa maintaining its position. So Africa remains the most important area for growing cashews. But there is a question mark as to whether, if we look 5, 10, 15 years forward, whether or not the increase that we would expect in West Africa, based on what we know today, will match the increase in demand, which seems to be, wherever you look, there's an increase in demand for cashew kernels. Looking at prices, so let's try and put these prices somehow into context. It's been more than a strange 12 months, let's say, and it's difficult to judge exactly where we stand as a result. First thing I suppose we should say is that the coronavirus didn't impact demand in the way that was expected by many. Demand was very positive last year. Prices are roughly where they were, what's that, about almost 12 years ago. We've seen two big rallies. We did see prices approach these current levels a few years back. We're right on the 2-year average now, but we're well below the medium or the long-term trend in prices. So despite the volatility, it is possible to work out the likely trend in prices. And we would have expected to be at higher prices than we are today. The good news on prices is that at these levels, cashew kernel demand is going to grow quickly. At these levels, cashew kernels look attractive to roasters. The consumers are not likely, if we take the reasons for increases in consumption, consumers are not likely to be increased or to be influenced by the type of price increase that we can envisage for the foreseeable future. So even if prices go up this year, consumers probably, outside of India, consumers probably won't see that impact until next year. They probably will not be overly influenced by an increase in price, say to the 340, 350 range that I mentioned earlier. It would have to go higher before it would become a major factor for them. If we look at RCN prices, the big point about RCN prices really is that they still look a little bit high compared to the current kernels prices. And at some point, this becomes a product for processing, for adding value to and for selling on as a kernel. It's been tough times for processors in India especially, but also in Vietnam, also throughout Africa. Margins are pretty tight. If you take today's rough level of RCN pricing, margins are very tight. Even if they do everything right, even if they process, control breakage, have their cost under control, it's still a tight margin. And there is still a factor. I often think that sometimes we look at large cashew factories and they keep going based on cash flow without really looking at whether they're making money or not. But that can't continue. So at some point, RCN prices have to come to match kernels. That would mean right now that RCN prices are a little bit overpriced. But I don't see any real impetus for a drop in RCN prices, particularly international prices. So therefore, we'd more or less be looking for an increase in kernels to bring that into equilibrium. There doesn't seem to be much interest for one of those periods of speculation, which have become, too common in our industry. And for that reason, I don't think that we're going to see a major upside on RCN. I think there is significant upside opportunity or upside potential on kernels, but not as much on RCN. And if it were to emerge, it would probably be either for some form of technical reason, a shortage, short-term shortage, or for speculation, which I don't think is likely in the era of a pandemic. So let's have a look then at the overall outlook. On demand, strong growth in almost all markets, and not the type of growth that's going to be influenced by prices, particularly in Western countries. It's driven by healthy food consumption, by convenience, by snacking, and a number of other factors, which won't be influenced by price. I think that 2021 is likely to see a return to demand growth in India, certainly growth on 2020, probably growth on a more normal market, 2019. Price is not a major factor. Cashews are really pretty good value, and the consumer is not going to see these price increases handed on if they were to materialize anyway. There is some concern in the concentration of processing for buyers of kernels. We are seeing a number of buyers question whether they should be diversifying their sources of supply. We have seen a growth in the share in the European market, in the European Union. The European Union share in the market grew by about 1% last year. It's about 7.3%, and it's growing at a rate of about 12%. So that's positive for African kernels. It's nowhere near what it should be, but it is a positive trend. Unfortunately, it's less so in the United States. The African kernels share actually fell in the United States last year. I believe it fell below 3% to something like 2.75%, which is disappointing. That's the outlook on demand. Generally positive all round, an opportunity for African processors perhaps in 2021. Look at the supply situation, really coming back and summarizing what we've talked about. Later or lower crop in Vietnam has the possibility to change the market psychology, to change the market sentiment, but it's unlikely to have a huge effect on the fundamental balance between supply and demand. That is, unless India or West Africa were to have a significant problem, and we don't see either of those factors emerging at the moment. In terms of the timing of supply, it looks to me as if there may be a tightness in the market on kernels during April and May. It'll be interesting to see how kernels buyers react to that. We should always be careful. There are some low-priced contracts owed in the market. Some buyers are depending on receiving those, and they may well be sparked into action if they start to realize that their contracts are at risk. It looks to me that African crops, once we get through this tightness, can balance out supply and demand, and that we won't have any fundamental shortage emerging this year. So a lot of people have asked the question, why are kernels prices not higher? In this situation, should they not be higher? If we take a benchmark around $3.10 for a good shipper, for a medium shipment position. And I'm trying to think why have they not risen a little bit? I mean, why have they not risen to say 320, which is where they were before the pandemic last year? Now, if you think about it, there's a few factors here. First of all, most people don't want them to be higher. If you're a processor, you need to buy RCN. You don't want the market higher. If you're an importer, you probably need to buy RCN. You may well be relying on low-price contracts. You don't want the market to go up, nor does a manufacturer or a roaster. Probably at this point in time, the only group that really wants this market to go up is farmers. And unfortunately, farmers don't have much say in what happens in this market. Maybe that's wrong, but that's the reality of it. Second reason is simply that the position in Vietnam is not clear. It's not clear whether the crop is lower or later. What is going to happen on that will determine the next move on kernels prices, I think. I would ask the question, though, in talking about that if the crop is just so late, why are imports so high? So I'm actually questioning my own conclusion now. Earlier I said imports were a bit lower at the end of last year. Stocks were lower coming into this year, and imports were higher. How do you know that as a buyer? So maybe we should be thinking, are some of the importers of RCN in Vietnam, are they already aware of a more serious problem than is apparent to the rest of us at this stage? There is still, I think, a bit of a misunderstanding, mainly at origin, of the impact of the pandemic on demand, of the impact of lockdowns on the demand for cashew kernels. It has been generally positive. It's been remarkable in some cases, looking at some of the third and fourth quarter imports last year. If we look at the roasters have some cover, they not in a particular rush. It is only March after all. Importers wait to see. People realize that there's not much opportunity in speculation on RCN at the moment because the kernels market is steady. So one leads to the other, keeping RCN calm, keeping kernels calm, and we'll see how that pans out in coming days. Looking at, there has been a consolidation in the buying of raw cashew nuts in recent years. And I think if you have fewer, larger, perhaps more organized and better financed organizations buying RCN, the market is likely to be less speculative and less volatile. And as a result, you see a 100,000 ton contract done. 10 years ago, that would have been maybe 52,000 ton contracts. 5 years ago, it would have been maybe 10 contracts. And now it's one huge contract. And that has a big impact on the motivation for speculation. It has an impact on the way the market works generally. So that keeps things calmer. So really, I suppose what I'm saying is, in answer to the question, so why are kernels prices not higher, is that we just really don't have the will for that right now. People are being quite conservative. There is still a lot of unknowns in the supply chain, in the global economic situation, in the pandemic. We haven't really seen the spark that could set kernels prices move up. What we've seen is a steady rise. I feel it's pausing for breath at the moment. I think it will eventually start to build another relatively orderly rise and maybe establish what I'm calling maybe a base camp around about $3.35 to $3.50 later in the year, which would probably be no harm for anyone. Unfortunately, it might be a bit late for West African farmers. That's an overview. That's an outlook. That's a lot of personal opinion on the market. I hope you've enjoyed that, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Jim Fitzpatrick. It's a pleasure hearing from you and also getting this update. Before I introduce our special guests who will have a conversation with you, let me remind everyone that we are coming to you live from Facebook Live, YouTube, and Microsoft Teams. Please put your questions in the Q&A feature for Zoom, and for the other platforms, please write it in the chat box so that we can announce them here for Jim and also his guest to deal with. Let me take the opportunity to recognize our sponsors and partners who have made this possible. And here I'm talking about Pro Cashew. I'm also talking about SNI, Sustainable Nuts Initiative, GIZ.com Cashew, Intersnack Procurement, TechnoServe Benin Cashew, and then Cashew Info. At this point, I would like to introduce our special guest, who is in the person of Mr. Will Schaefer, who is the Director, Tree Nuts at Intersnack Procurement, a subsidiary of Intersnack Group. He is responsible for the central procurement of materials and services needed by the group's management units located across Europe. Wim has been active in the food industry for about 30 years and held previously positions such as lead buyer, raw materials, sales manager, and then B2B and sourcing manager, Africa. The key words in his career are food, commerce, and change. His approach aligns with the values of the company, taking responsibility, growing together, and acting entrepreneurially. Welcome, Mr. Will Schaefer. It's always a pleasure to have you. And with Jim Fitzpatrick, at this point, I will leave you to exchange with Will Schaefer and to get a perspective on the end market. Thank you very much, and welcome.
Thanks, Ernest. Wim, how are you?
Yes, I'm very well. Thank you very much, Ernest. And Jim, you hear me and see me loud and clear?
I hear you very well. Thanks for joining us. It's very good of you to take time out to join us on this. It's really appreciated. It's not often we get someone from, with an overview on demand and an overview on buying that you have to join us on this. Take an opportunity, if I may, to talk to you a little bit about demand, and particularly about European demand. We've seen strong growth in recent years, particularly in the last 2 years. What do you think are the main factors driving the growth in European demand?
I think a very good question, and maybe not fully in line with what just said by you, Jim, is that say stable pricing is very important. That does not mean that consumers will leave cashew if prices are increasing with 20-25 cents. But we know that relatively stable and fair pricing for the consumer is an absolute must for market growth. That means, that with a price level of, say, everything between 275 and 350, of course, in the Eurozone, with a more or less stable and attractive US dollar, there will be offtake, and the price is attractive to the consumer. Don't get too much excited, because it is not a cheap buy. When you compare cashews with a bag of potato crisp or popcorn or maize extra dates, cashew is still at a higher end, but cashew is the ideal indulgence snack. It is very tasty, and due to its refined taste, it's also an accessible product and a very much likable product. So, as long as cashew offer good value, because that is the key word, consumers will buy it, and the group of people that like it, will only enlarge. So I think that pricing is a very important part, because consumers, they choose with their mouth, with their heart, but also with their wallet in the end, So the other, I think, very important factor is that it fits in the overall healthy pattern of the diets, what we see now more and more. We know that nuts are always in the Mediterranean diet, in the Atkins diet, and nowadays there is much to do about green proteins. So changing the source of protein from animals to plant-based protein. So nuts in general, and also cashew, fit in perfectly there. And then also what you just pointed out, Jim, COVID and the changing consumer behavior and spending of time is a part of it, because looking at Netflix subscriptions, you see an increase of I believe 25% over 2020. With Netflixing, people do consume their popcorn, but also their other snacks, amongst which cashew, at home. So that's also causing some tailwinds.
Yeah, so I mean that's interesting. The healthy aspect, but this aspect of the stability of price being important. So we're talking then about, it's not the absolute level of price. If I hear right, if prices went up by 20-30 cents a pound, it's not going to lead to an amazing fall off in demand. But that if prices were to shoot up and fall back again, that can have a much more damaging effect. Is that right?
Correct. Boom and bust is the worst thing that can happen for everybody, because what we have seen, 2016, 2017, is maybe farmers were happy at the time because they got a nice price, but then there was an extreme drop in demand, also in our side. Because what I said, it basically, we talk, when we talk about cashew, we talk, it's a very complex, diverse supply chain. But calculating the product is rather easy, and there's a high level of raw material and packaging material and currency into the retail price. So those changes are immediately put forward onto the retail shelf. So that will cause a collapse in the market. For example, we have seen that with macadamia. Macadamia increased because of a Chinese appetite for macadamias, and the total market in Europe shrunk because retailers, they took it off the shelf. There is a huge price elasticity. And that depends also on the retailer pricing in the market at the price levels that they choose. Is it crossing that psychological barrier, from €1 to €2, to €3, to €49, to €55? Consumers, they know that. And then they will switch to alternative products. Cashew is not the only snack that European consumers can choose from.
Sure, and it's probably one of the highest priced. Just looking at this here, then, I mean, we actually haven't had that stable prices. It has been bouncing around, but it's been in a range. Mm-hmm. We have a relatively favorable dollar. How do you see demand just on the short term in 2021? How do you see that panning out over the remaining part of this year?
I think that, that depends per market. We expect also some further growth in this year and also the years beyond. But, Northwestern Europe are mature markets. So the total absorption level for additional demand is, in our view, limited because there is maturity and kind of saturation. But looking at the other countries in the European area, of course, there is still room for growth. The per capita consumption, of course, it's much lower there. So with increased wealth, people may also go for the aspiration products, which is in snacking, it's cashews. Of course, again, there, prices are relatively stable. That is really one of the conditions. What we also can see, because of the popularity, because of the quest for green proteins, cashew will do very, very good as ingredients in other product categories, and especially, for brokens, for pieces, etc., that can also bring a relief to the cashew industry in general. There are only then the two other conditions. There needs to be good marketing of it, and because unlike India, in Europe, but it's a bit different also from America. In Europe, there is not a lot of marketing done in marketing the off-grades in the cashew. And the other requirement is clean product. When talking with other food manufacturers, for example, in cookie and chocolate, they always complain about the impurities in cashew. So go for a food safe product, do a GFSI certification and offer really a good and safe sound product. That's an absolute must. I think that the other area is that, but that is a bit of the marketing, there are line extensions. So you've got your natural cashew, you've got your roasted salted cashew, and then you go to an air roasted product. Although, the oil absorption in cashew is relatively negligible, maybe 2%. So roasting has a good, a health perception. But also a coating of cashew, flavoring of cashew can also be possible as line extensions, so our marketing people use to grow the cashew category.
It's interesting me on the broken. I mean, I've often thought that the volatility in broken grades. I mean, if you were looking at launching a new product 3 years ago and you looked at the price of brokens and then you looked at it again and it's 50, 60, 70 cents, $1 a pound lower, that's actually, might be a little bit attractive to see a lower price, but it's actually very scary, isn't it? Because if you're developing and investing in a new product, you don't want to see the raw material price bouncing around all over the place.
Jim, again, we are back at price stability.
Right.
And I know that on one of my first international nut councils that I attended in 1996, the buyer of Hershey's in the US was complaining on the almond industry because of prices going up and down. And when you have a nice product, a new product development process, so when you launch your plan, you get a go. But when you are at gate 4, the price is completely different, and your business plan is worth nothing. So also there it is extremely important. But this is also the nice part about cashews. We grow as an industry together here, and we see. I hope that this price stability and maybe over time a slow increase, will remain there, because then you create the conditions also for research and development people and new product developers, to work with cashew. That's an absolute must, yeah. But I have good faith that this will come, and maybe they are now underpriced. But let's they should arrive at a level that is a certain formula, and it will go, absorbable. Yeah?
Right. So, I mean, if I look at that and I think about this problem that we have of brokens, or the difficulty in marketing brokens, really, from what you're saying, we need to focus on reducing foreign matter, making sure that product is ready to go into process, getting a good food safety certification in the factories, making sure that the price movements are manageable, let's say, that insofar as possible that there would be some relative stability in brokens prices. And the one thing, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because it's something that always bothers me, is that we don't actually market, from a raw material point of view, we don't actually market very well. In fact, we don't actually market at all to a large extent. I see factories, I work with factories with, let's say, a brokens problem, a warehouse with, they essentially hope the market will save them. They hope that prices will go up and they'll be able to move it on, rather than actually focusing on who do we need to be selling to, where is there an opportunity, what do we need to do with this product. So I'm really happy you mentioned that, and I hope that some of our developing processors in African countries are listening to you on that one. Speaking of Africa, I know you've been a supporter of the African cashew industry yourself, and Intersnack as an organization. I know you've lived in Côte d'Ivoire. You've spent a lot of time working in African countries. What developments would you like to see to make it possible to source more cashews in Africa? I know that the general trend I mentioned earlier is about 7% market share in Europe. What developments would you like to see, and structural or processing in whatever way, to make it easier for you to source more cashew kernels in African countries?
But before I go to that, Jim, let me point out that, and that is in addition to the import figures in China that you just showed, because China was for years about 50,000 tons of kernels, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
And, that is relatively low for a country with 1 billion consumers and with an increasing wealth. So going forward, the Western markets need the African processing industry, because we are buying so much in Vietnam, does not imply that we are against an African industry. But, and there's a big but, the industry and the product needs to qualify, to put on the market to the final consumers, So, and then I come back to say, basically answering your question, what we need is to have a competitive price product, So there is the question about the productivity in the factories that needs to be at par or relatively at par with Vietnam. It needs to be a quality product. So when, for example, AFI is the global reference, make it against AFI. There is clearly a food safety requirement, and that is all known, spelled out. It is Global Food Safety Initiative. There are numerous of certification schemes that you need to qualify. We sponsored ACA via the ACA seal. Well, that is not the end. It's the beginning. To jump to GFSI certified, because that is known in the globe, on the globe, for food safety certification. And last but not least, there is the social compliant element that needs to be ticked the boxes. So fair dealing with your farmers and good working conditions in the factories. So, through a kind of SMETA ethical assessment. These are absolutely needed to qualify to the European market. And we are more or less also at par with this the 8% what you talk that we source from Africa, and that's also how we contribute to the development of the industry. And what we observe in general is that there is a lack of volume. So there is installed capacity and there's utilized capacity. There's a big gap. Yeah? We see there is lack of certification. What I mentioned, the GFSI and the SMETA. When we ask for offers, we get offers for mixed containers. But we buy many containers and we want to have one grade in one container because it goes to a certain laboratory and that needs to test, analyze, and test for the product. So if we have 3 grades in one container, we pay 3 times the price for the certification. So that's not really interesting. What we observe also is still an unstable and vulnerable industry. So where we have clearly, we see identify stars in the industry that can become, the future business leaders in Africa. But we see them struggling. We see very good investment with greenfield turnkey projects that are also not operating. So, and that makes it quite difficult also to source from. And I think that also we need to realize that Africa as a source is not a single reason for consumers or retailers to buy your product. They want to have a tasty and reasonably priced product, without any headaches. Yeah, so no impurities in. Anyhow, most consumers don't even know where cashews grow, and we keep on telling them, every now and then in these in-house magazines from retailers, there are stories about the cashew farmers, about Cashew and all the projects that are being done, but still, that awareness and a kind of goodwill for Africa is limited, so when we want to serve the mainstream markets, we need to professionalize ourselves more as a cashew industry. Yeah, and because basically, you want to play football in the Premier League, you need to be a football player that qualifies for the Premier League, and that's it.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's about professionalization, really, isn't it? I mean, and one thing I think that listening to what you're saying about quality, competitiveness, food safety, and social responsibility, all of these factors, it's never been easier to get information on what you need to do as a processor to meet buyers' requirements. For the first time, all of these things are possible. And also, if we think about the changes in technology, competitiveness, I feel, is that little bit, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's that little bit more accessible than it was even 5-10 years ago. It's really interesting to hear these factors. I mean, there are a few success stories around, but not enough of them. No. And I hope people are, I hope people planning investments or developing their cashew businesses are listening to the factors that you're saying today will make a difference for you. Let's, thanks very much for that, Wim. Let's hand back to Ernest and see if he's got any interesting comments or questions for us.
Thank you very much, Jim, and also thanks very much, Wim. Before I go to a question here from Pamela Taylor, from a different platform, we have a question that I believe goes to our special guest, which I would like to take that first. I think you have, by and large, answered it. It's talking about diversification of kernel buying sources and what is the silver bullet here, or key factor to make the shift to Africa happen. I know you've talked about improvements in productivity, quality, food safety issues, social compliance element. And then you've also made the analogy with the Premier League, which should send home the message rightly. But then maybe another aspect of it could be what of the investment climate and the policies in the different countries? What exactly should change or shift for this to happen, for buyers such as you to be attracted to invest even in certain processing factories, and also to have the processing happen in the way that will answer to some of the issues you raised and also to your concern as investors?
Yeah, Ernest, I think that, of course, this is also a question to be answered by the African processors. But what we observe, for example, is availability of the right workers. For factories, we see there's more and more mechanization, and I believe in mechanization going forward. But if you do mechanization, you need to have service maintenance contracts with your machine suppliers. So there needs to be a hub in West Africa, to have acceptable response times to address a failure, for example. Yeah, there needs to be access to banking lines to obtain the raw cashew nut, because in West Africa you need to buy as a processor, I'm afraid, 12 months ahead, or more or less 12 months ahead. So you need to have a credit line, or you need to have funds yourself, of course. So and then what I said also about the social compliance, the quality, and food safety, that requires a certain level of people. Well, I know that within Cashew, there is a kind of mid-higher level of people being trained, with the master training program. And that's extremely important to offer that to the cashew industry.
Okay.
Is that answering your question, Ernest?
Yeah, it does address it. And the other question that I have here, even though it is something that Jim talked about, but then the question is directed at you. What has been the freight cost markup, and by how much quantitatively has it impacted on kernel demand from Africa? Because I think Wim talked about the fact that now the freight costs are going up, and it is as a result generating more, and the person is then wanting for you as some buyer, probably buying also from Vietnam and from Africa, whether you see or can quantify this freight cost markup, and by how much it is impacting on the business decision to buy from Africa or from Vietnam.
Yeah, we are an industry. We are a road, not do very much opportunistic transactions in this sense. So, for example, we see the container price from Vietnam to Rotterdam is quadrupling. No, so we will buy all our cashews in West Africa. No, it's not happening like that. We've got long-term established contacts and also contracts, and we honor these as well. On top of that, apart from a transport price, there's also, say, a baseline price or a baseline FOB price. So and that also, your assumption or the assumption from the person who asked the question is that is the same, and that is not always the same, of course. When I hear Jim talking about, hey, there may be risk of defaults at the price level of 285. Yeah, come on, guys. There should not be a risk of default when there's a price change of 25 cents. Then you need to ask yourself, or you need to ask your sourcing policy and your supplier selection procedure there. These are all things, that are part of our sourcing decisions, Ernest. So it's not only, a change in the freight price or a blocking in the Suez Canal. There's more to it.
Okay. Let me move to Jim to also see whether he has some response on this. Any quantitative measures or let's say even, can you quantify by how much the freight cost has gone up, and then what exact impact, quantitative impact it has had on kernel demand?
I wasn't actually talking about the price as such. What I was talking more about was the disruption to the supply chain. The price is the symptom of the disruption. So if the price of a container goes from 700 to 3,000 for freight or more, that's a symptom of something else. So what I'm talking about really is the disruption in the supply chain causing people to consider buying more in Africa. Now, as Wim says, some will be more opportunistic and they will say, okay, I'm going to try and buy now to solve an immediate need because I'm not getting what I need in time from Vietnam. That's one side. It may also focus manufacturers just on the concept that maybe I need to diversify my supply chain. But that plays its way out over years, not over weeks. Right. That you change your policy over years. Whereas if you're an importer and you have a customer who wants a container within 3 or 4 weeks, you look for an opportunity to trade. But businesses like Intersnack would not change purchasing policy in a week or 2 weeks, or maybe in a year, or maybe even in 2 years. So what I'm referring to is two things. And we always need to distinguish between short-term impact and long-term impact. So the short-term impact is there will be opportunistic buying in West Africa if containers are ready and there is a difficulty getting containers from Vietnam, whether that's related to freight or whether it's related to a tightness of supply. But secondly, it underlines a fundamental weakness in the supply chain, which if you listen to Wim carefully, you hear that coming through, because he said that a high dependence on one origin, not specifically Vietnam nor anywhere else, but on one origin, normally for a buyer would mean I'd like to diversify, and what he's looking for is qualified suppliers. So the longer term impact means the convergence of the idea of diversifying supply combined with the availability of qualified suppliers. And we know what that means now because he's told us this morning. It means quality, particularly impurities. It means good food safety practices. It means competitive pricing, and it means social responsibility. And if those areas are addressed, then it's natural for buyers to diversify their supply to Africa. So it's not so much a sense of looking at this disruption and saying that'll bring everyone to Africa. Buyers will still not buy inferior product or high farm material product or product that's, unrealistically priced. But in the short term, for those qualified suppliers, so if you take some of the companies you were showing in the videos before we started to talk today, Ernest, you take some of those processors that are qualified, they're going to see more interest simply because they're ready to go. They've got perhaps it's a BRC certification, they've got their food safety, they've got their quality, and they can compete on price. And maybe, as we saw last year, they might get a few cents more because freight rates are higher. But the freight rate is not the thing to focus on, in my opinion. The thing to focus on is, what does the freight rate tell us? And the freight rate tells us that the supply chain is stretched, that it's difficult, and that can happen again. Mm-hmm. And therefore, that has longer term impact. So we might see importers, flexible or smaller buyers in a flexible position, come and buy some containers, or you might see people in the event of a difficulty buy some containers in West Africa. That's one. But the other aspect is you might see a much longer kick on from this. The absolute freight rate, I think it's about 4 times what it was. And that's a simple answer to that question. That has an impact. Of course it has. Margins are tight for most businesses. And even though freight is a very small percentage of the overall package, it's not a very small percentage of the overall margin when you look at that increase in freight. It is a significant impact on roasters' margins, on packers' margins, on importers' margins. So it does have an impact. And I think it's also, I see the other question. I think this is a really great question. If you don't mind, Ernest, I'm just going to drag this question in, where Gobena Taylor asks us, why is the African market share in the US so low?
You are going directly onto the questions that are here. Maybe before you take that one, because one of them is linked straight to what Wim has been talking about, and maybe he can just confirm it in passing. Because the questioner wants to know, apart from long-term contracts, and this is to Wim, apart from long-term contracts, do you also sometimes do spot buying if there's exceptional quality product or at very attractive prices? But that for me will be something you answer in passing. But there is one that says, hi Wim, great talk. Do you think the larger market increase in Europe comes from more pieces usage versus whole cashew usage? And there will be more acceptance of pieces in the European market as quality standards improve and prices remain stable. So these are two questions that I want you to touch on before we come to Gobena Taylor.
Yeah, we do buy also spot. That can be the reason for that, to pick up loads, to improve our physical stock position. Sales forecast is always a difficult science, obviously, for sales organizations. So that's, I think, the normal supply chain practice. But what I said, normally we tend to buy longer term contracts. So these are more opportunities that we see. But a spot contract can also be at a higher price. So it's not always a financial opportunity. It sometimes can be a necessity to repair something that is being caused by a logistical thing. And again, Ernest, what is
the question was whether you think the larger market increase in Europe comes from more pieces usage versus whole cashew usage, and whether there will be more acceptance of pieces in Europe or European market as quality standards improve and prices remain stable.
Yeah, it's a qualifier. So, and that is not particular for African cashew. It is for cashew usage as a whole. That quality standards and food safety standards needs to be there and needs to be delivered in combination with more or less stable pricing. That will grow. But the other very important thing is that we need to, make food manufacturers enthusiastic about using cashew ingredients as an ingredient in their product lines. That is very important, because when you look at chocolates, baseline is hazels and almonds. So relatively there are not that many cashews being used in the product portfolio of chocolate manufacturers, and also not on cookie manufacturers, because it has a subtle taste, and when making the product, sometimes you get the feeling that the taste of cashew will disappear. But one of our top products is a chocolate coated cashew, so it can be liked, but it is a kind of chicken and egg situation. We don't see these manufacturers going to Africa or Vietnam or India to look for ideas, and because it's not part of the portfolio, it's also not being brought the other way. As Intersnack, it's not our segment. We are more in the snacking consumer packages. That's our part. But we see our suppliers sometimes struggling with their byproducts and with the valuation of the byproducts that is, hurting their bottom line, of course.
Thank you very much. So now we move to Gobena Taylor, himself a processor for many years. And he's asking, why is African kernels market share in the US so low and actually going down currently in spite of an increase in processing capacity in especially West Africa and its proximity to the US? So Jim, if you can address this, yes.
Yeah, it's a great question. if we look at last year, one of the reasons why it declined is because the American market grew quickly. So that's a factor that it's just a fact of numbers that we have to take into account. But the reality is that the American market is very distinct from the European market in two ways. Firstly, it's a highly price sensitive market, even more than the European market. Highly competitive, highly price sensitive, highly private label brands. The second aspect is that most US buyers tend to buy using importers. And that means that the focus is much more on price, and the focus is therefore on a much shorter time frame. So it's not unusual to talk to a large American roaster and find they actually have no idea about the cashew market other than what comes in from their handful of suppliers. And it's actually not unusual to find that they don't care either, that their interest is that the product of the right spec is delivered to their door at a competitive price. That's not a criticism, that's the way that business is done in that particular market segment. So if African countries want to increase their share of the US market, and they should, they're only going to do so by being competitive. So those basic qualifiers, quality, food safety should be there. Secondly, competitive pricing. And thirdly, and maybe this is the thing where we could learn something from the almond business and from the marketing of almonds over the years, you have to go and sell. You have to bring a product, bring a package that's competitive, that's attractive, and that builds the buyer's confidence. And unfortunately, we haven't done that. So the two areas for it's probable that becoming qualified for the European market in terms of food safety, social responsibility is probably more difficult than the US market. But then European buyers tend to pay better prices. Competitiveness is the big factor for the US market. Combined competitiveness and marketing, and this drop can change. As it is, 91% purchasing from Vietnam. India's lost ground in the US. Brazil has lost ground in the US. Africa has lost ground in the US. And it's all down to the fact on price. Now, we could say maybe US buyers are taking more risks than they should. And if you said that, I'd agree with you. But it doesn't change the facts. And the fact is that the African share has dropped below 3%, and that shouldn't be happening. And I think it's time to do something about that. And I'm looking at organizations like yourselves, Ernest, and some of the projects you're working with to improve the profile of African cashews in the United States, but also to look at competitiveness, price competitiveness as a basic factor in competing in that market. And bear in mind, it's a very good market for brokens. Mm-hmm. Americans do buy quite a percentage of brokens, and there's no reason not to be price competitive on brokens if you've got warehouses full of brokens that can't be moved, as was the case a couple of years ago.
Thank you, Jim. The next question is also for you. It says, Jim, thanks for the presentation. You mentioned the price resistance to RCN, price resistance for RCN into Vietnam and India because of kernel prices. Do you think the freight disturbances and challenges in container availability will create arbitrage of high destination market prices compared to origin for RCN? You've touched a bit on this, but maybe if you can just address it within the context of this question. Yeah.
All right. So look, when we think about cashews, you can't. It's very difficult to talk about arbitrage and trading strategies because the market is not always liquid. So it's not a case that you can have a warehouse full of RCN and you can decide in any given moment I'm going to sell this. It's a little bit more complex than that. So I think that no, it won't create arbitrage opportunities. What I think is that the RCN price has to come into alignment with the kernel's price, and it has to stay there. And for my mind, that's the key to stability in pricing. So if RCN and kernel's prices are in line, we know where we stand, we know where the market is. I think the freight disturbances and challenges in container availability are there right now. It's impacting some people's bottom line. It's impacting the supply chain, but it's 6 months that that's solved. Maybe before that, there are actions going on right now to solve it. I noticed the Chinese government has become involved. The Indian government has become involved. So I think if we look at it in the long term, it probably doesn't create such an arbitrage. The real opportunity here, to my mind, is to a more balanced supply chain where more product is processed in African countries for supply to buyers in the United States and in Europe.
Okay. So let me, is Wim still around? Hello, Wim, your video appears to be up. Very good. You can also give some reaction on the earlier questions, but then there's one here that I want to take quickly with you. It says, Wim, with the increase in nuts usage in the food business in India and China, do you see Intersnack moving into these markets as consumption locations? I think you touched a bit on China, the importance of China, but then it's more as a business entity, whether you are looking at moving into those markets.
Oh, well, that's not my area of responsibility, luckily. I stay with cashew sourcing and other tree nut sourcing, Ernest. So why not? I would say, but we cannot exclude that going into those directions. But I think that for now we are very happy where we are. But companies like ourselves always look for growth opportunities. So it is a big jump. Going into those markets, there are huge cultural differences. We are very depending on sales to, say, the larger retailers, say the supermarket stores and the hypermarkets. So the type of distribution will be very important for our decision to take a jump to those markets.
Thank you very much. This question. Yes, continue.
Yeah, one little point on Jim and the example of the almond industry. Yeah. And I take very often the almond industry as a very successful organization, how to organize and market agricultural commodities. And that is also the main difference is that in California, of course, apart from being in a very close proximity, everybody is in basically San Joaquin Valley, a part of California. There's also the Almond Board of California being extremely instrumental, and gaining maybe 5 cents, 2 cents per pound in order to make that organization very rich as a marketing tool, also with recipes, but also having the technical experts that can talk on high level with legislators, on nutritional values, on toxins, on sampling, etc., etc. So as a cashew industry, we are moving into that direction, but we are not yet there. You are very important. Cashew is very important. We've got FINACAS, we've got the Cashew Export Promotion Council in India, we've got the Global Cashew Council, but we need to bond more. If we want to have that agility and that effectiveness of the Almond Board of California, but saying like an almond plantation, which is my future dream for a cashew orchard, we need to have a vision there as an industry, how we want to develop and what is the point on the horizon. Yeah? I think that is much needed and that can bring cashew to the next level.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, there's a question still for you and also for Jim. And this is coming from Roger Brew, himself a former managing director of the ACA and now into processing in Cote d'Ivoire. So he said, Jim spoke about the need for greater correlation between kernel price movements versus RCN price. What needs to be done by key value chain players to create a transparent global cashew trading system similar to the cocoa market to embed predictability in the fabric of cashew kernel and the RCN prices and make this speculation more attractive to the financial sector, for instance, in support of African players. So here I know also, Jim, we've been talking about in the past having some kind of a trading platform, with, the buying of raw cashew in Africa in a very systematic way, also to allow for even all this forward trading and spot trading, all those things to happen here on the continent, and the challenges around warehousing to make that happen. So maybe your take on it, and I'll start with Jim. I know it's a topic you have mentioned or touched on in the past also. Jim, your mic is off. Hello, Jim. Your microphone is off. Thank you.
Yes, Ernest. I'm trying to buy some time on this question.
Very good.
Yeah, it's okay. So if we look at this, I think that the first thing that would make sense to me is more integrated supply chains. So that rather than have this rather disjointed supply chain that we have at the moment, that businesses work to integrate their supply chains. And that includes right back to the farm gate for processors. I think that the establishment of a trading platform, and I'm going to take that to mean an exchange of some sort. The basis for an exchange has always got to be physical delivery of the products. The rest follows. The interest from banks and pension funds and investors of all sorts follows. So what I think we should be talking about is an opportunity to establish a physical trading platform, which, as you rightly predict, I would say, means infrastructure. So if you're going to have a platform, you might see it on your computer screen, but somewhere behind it, there has to be warehouses, drying yards, bagging facilities, and the contracts have to be deliverable. So I think I would say that the first thing that's needed is infrastructure. And that must be accompanied by processors and particularly buyers of RCN at the first stage, integrating their supply chain so that they do want to know where the product comes from. They do want to be able to track it back in the system. They do want to know that people in the chain are reasonably well treated. They're not taking it from just a speculative point of view. They're not using the availability of cash to control the market if they have that facility, and that they are looking at their processing operations as part of an integrated supply chain that involves processing and export of kernels, and not simply as vehicles to facilitate trading in RCN. In other words, that we stop thinking like speculators and we start thinking like industrialists. That for me is the key thing that creates the correlation between the kernel price and the RCN price. And let's not forget, in cocoa, sometimes the cocoa market is actually distorted by its transparency, because you get money coming into commodities which maybe shouldn't be in commodities at times, and that can force markets up or force markets down, sometimes when it has nothing to do with the fundamentals. This is a great question, and of course we could go on about this all day, but I'll hand it over to Wim.
Yeah, I see that, Jim, in line with you. The trend is more openness. So the consumers basically want to know where is my food coming from. You know, in blockchain techniques, there are even possibilities, say, to tip the farmer. You know, when you like your bananas, you can send $1 to Costa Rica. You know, that is technically, it's all possible. You know, so I think that then you need to go to more an integrated and a connected supply chain. And I do believe in transparency, you know, in order to make the exposure lower. You know, so now when we look at the cashew market, we also, there's not one cashew market. There's an RCN market and there's a kernel market, you know, and because these don't always behave in line with each other, that creates exposure, you know, and that is in itself can also be a reason for defaults, you know, from delivery, from RCN, from kernels, from buying, etc. You know, so and we are stronger believers. So when we know more, and when the stakeholders know more about, you know, availability, so crop forecasting, pricing that are being quoted, and prices that are being concluded, I think that in the end will lead to a more stable pricing again. and that is in the sake of development of the industry.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have only 3 minutes to go, so I will take the last question, and then I will then come back to you for your final thoughts. The last question is about, in fact, the person is asking, can you comment? And I believe it's also to Jim, but since Wim wants to go into almonds in the future, he also can bring your views on that. Can you comment a bit on how cashew kernels are priced versus almonds and others? And how do consumers in Europe and the US view them at this moment? Will there be some level of switching that's possible? I mean, will there be some kind of switching from cashew to almonds, or the other way back also? So I'll start with Jim, your thoughts on this, and particularly how it is calculated, those prices are calculated or arrived at compared to almonds. Yes.
But traditionally, almonds, hazelnuts, walnuts are regarded as more food ingredients than snack products. So you have to make that distinction to begin with. So the level of switching to cashews is reduced by simply the fact that it's so difficult to buy a ready-made ingredient. If you buy almonds from California or hazelnuts from Turkey, you can buy them blanched, chopped, diced, low levels of foreign matter, guarantees, packed as you want them, ready to go into your process. It is nearly impossible to do the same in cashews, at least widely. There may be some examples where you can. So that limits the opportunity to switch from food ingredient usage of almonds or hazelnuts or walnuts into cashew nuts. Vim slightly referred to that already. I think in the snack food sector, we've probably seen almonds make more inroads into the sector than the other way around, the cashews digging into almonds. I remember an American roaster telling me years ago that the inclusion when they make up their mixed nut packs, which is important in the US, there's a mix of all different kinds of nuts in there, but the one that actually sells the product is the cashew. That's the one that the consumer is looking for. They buy mixed nuts because they're a little bit cheaper, but they're looking for more cashews in there. They're not particularly looking for almonds, Brazil nuts, or other nuts. So in that sense, why would someone reduce the cashews in the bag in a mixed nut? And they would do so because volatility on price, plainly, simply. If you're sitting in 2015, you're looking at a $3.20, $3.20, or $3.40, $3.20. You're going, I'm going to maximize cashews in that mixed nut bag. By the end of 2016, prices heading for $4.50, and into 2017, you've minimized the cashews. And it comes back to Vim's point earlier that positive switching to cashews is dependent on, main factor is stability of price, predictability of price. This is a huge factor limiting the switches to cashews. And after that, then will come all the other qualification factors in terms of quality, food safety, and other factors. So I don't think this is a straightforward question. I don't think, for example, you can say if almonds are low priced, people will buy more almonds than cashews. I think it's very different segment to segment, but Vim will know that one very well, I think.
Yeah. So with your thoughts.
Thanks, Jim. A straightforward answer is that, basically a comparable quality and size almond, you pay $2.50 FOB nowadays, compared to a $3.20 FOB now. What is it? $2.95, $3. So almonds are cheaper. But indeed, that is not the decisive factor. Almonds indeed are more used as an ingredient, more used in cereals, for example, than as a plain snack product. But snack products are increasing. Also almond imports in Europe are increasing, and also our sales in almonds. It's a very nice and very nice grow indeed. What I understood also from India is that a year ago, or maybe not even a year ago, we have seen a very strange import pattern in India. Is that the sales of cashew, we were told, was decreasing. But we see imports of almond from the States increasing. So I asked the question to one of my Indian contacts, how is that possible? And they say, well, consumers believe that almonds are more healthy, than cashew. And that is, I don't know exactly the nutritional facts, but both are in the healthy corner, but one can maybe have certain elements that it is just a bit better. But it can also be that there is better marketing, that is supporting the perception, because health is a perception thing as well to a big extent. Again, a reason, to come more together, to bond and to have proper marketing in place there. Yeah?
Thank you very much. So I will remain with you, Wim, and to take your concluding remarks before I move on to Jim. So please, your any final remarks on the market, on the issues you have talked about today. Yeah,
well, guys, thanks. It's a privilege to be in your webinar. In general, we are Intersnack supporter of the ACA and the African cashew industry for many years now. I think there's huge opportunity. It is not a walk in the park. Every African processor will underwrite that. Cashew processing, making money by processing cashew is an art, and you need to have the skills to do that. But please have also faith in the future. There is an increased demand. And there's when you look at, say, the sourcing needs for Western roasters, that includes the US and Europe, there is a need for a mature and a very well established and African cashew industry.
Thank you very much. Jimmy, your concluding remarks?
Thanks, Wim, first of all, for joining us today. I think the response in the questions shows a real level of interest in hearing what you've got to talk about. So thank you for that. My concluding remarks would be two things. I remain optimistic, as I always try to be on this sector, and I think there's enough reason for that. But secondly, when we talk about the market outlook and we talk about the current situation, be careful when you analyze this market that you look at what are the long-term factors and what are the short-term factors. So when we look at the long-term position, it's very optimistic. When we look at the short-term factors, and this is where we talk about imports into Vietnam, the current price, what the price might be in a month, or CN trade, these are all short-term factors. And it's important to distinguish that when we try to make our decisions in the market. What's a short-term factor? What's a long-term factor? And I'll give you an example. I remember someone saying to me in 2015, as the market was rising, prices for LWPs were, I think, 25 cents down from 450s. And someone said to me, Jim, we'll never have to worry about marketing brokens again. And that was a real example of taking a very